in the high, rain-swept valleys of the Allegheny Mountains, where the stagecoach road twisted through ancient forests like a wounded serpent. There once stood a manor that travelers spoke of in whispers touched with awe. Blackwood Manor, they called it, a place that offered something far rarer than a warm meal or a dry bed. It offered a kind of peace that settled into a man's bones, a sense of having stumbled not just upon shelter, but upon redemption itself. 3 brothers ran this mountain refuge, though ran was too coarse a word for the effortless grace with which they managed it. Weary souls would arrive as strangers, their faces carved by loss or desperation, and within a day, they would find themselves laughing by the fire, drinking the brothers' aged rye, and speaking of futures they had long since abandoned. The Ellsworth brothers had a reputation that bled across 3 territories. Fur traders would alter their routes by a week's travel just to spend a single night beneath Blackwood's roof. Land agents would delay their business dealings, claiming bad weather or broken wagon wheels, when in truth they simply could not bring themselves to leave the manor's peculiar embrace. And those who had stayed spoke of a comfort so profound, so unexpectedly intimate, that grown men hard men who had weathered prairie fires and river pirates would find their eyes stinging when the time came to saddle up and ride on. But in the autumn of 1876, something shifted. Travelers began arriving at settlements throughout western Pennsylvania with strange, unsettled tales. The road to Blackwood Manor, they said, had grown unnervingly quiet. They spoke of overturned wagons, their cargo strewn and rotting, and of horses wandering riderless, their saddles still cinched tight. Local authorities dismissed these reports as the usual frontier embellishments, the kind of stories that bloomed like fungi in the damp darkness of mountain taverns. That was until a pattern began to form, a pattern too precise, too deliberate to be ignored. Dozens of men had vanished along that winding mountain corridor, and the last place anyone had seen them was on the sloping, tree-lined path that led to the Ellsworth brothers' welcoming door. Before we go deeper into what was uncovered in those haunted Allegheny highlands, I want you to pause for a moment. Picture yourself there. Picture the fog that rolled down the ridgeline each evening like a slow, silent tide. Picture the single lantern that hung from the manor's porch, swaying in a wind that never seemed to stop. Picture the sound of a fiddle drifting through the trees at dusk, a melody you almost recognized but could never quite name. And ask yourself this: if you had been traveling alone, your money running low, your hope running thinner, and you saw that light through the trees, would you have knocked? Or would you have kept riding into the dark, trusting the instinct that told you something was wrong? What the authorities were about to uncover would reveal that the solace men found at Blackwood Manor came with a cost more terrible than any nightmare could conjure. It would expose a machinery of death so methodical, so disguised by charm and competence, that it had operated for nearly 2 decades without a single formal accusation. And at the center of it all were 3 brothers who had learned, through years of quiet observation, exactly how to make a man disappear without anyone noticing he was gone. The year was 1858, when Elias Ellsworth succumbed to a fever that swept through the mountain settlements, leaving behind a sprawling estate in the Allegheny highlands and 3 sons who ranged in age from 19 to 31. Located in a remote pocket of western Pennsylvania, where the borders of Ohio and Virginia seemed distant rumors rather than tangible places, the Ellsworth property stretched across nearly 1,000 acres of timber-rich land. It was land that had been in the family for 3 generations, first claimed by their grandfather, a surveyor who had seen something in these hills that others had missed. something valuable, something worth fighting for. There was a sawmill that hummed with activity along the creek, a grist mill that served the scattered homesteads for miles around, a herd of cattle that grazed the lower pastures, and most crucially, a manor house that had become a necessary waypoint for anyone traveling the stagecoach road between Pittsburgh and the growing settlements to the west. Silas, the eldest at 31, was the architect of their prosperity. He possessed a mind that saw angles where others saw only surfaces, a gift for reading men's weaknesses and calculating exactly how much pressure they could bear before they broke. He was not a large man, nor a physically imposing one, but there was something in his stillness that commanded attention, something in his pale, unblinking eyes that made men feel seen in ways they did not entirely enjoy. He kept the books, negotiated the deals, and made the decisions. And he made them coldly, without sentiment, without hesitation. Malcolm, 28, was the face the world saw. Where Silas was calculating, Malcolm was warm. Where Silas was distant, Malcolm was present. He had inherited his mother's Irish charm, her gift for storytelling, her ability to make any man feel like he was the most interesting person in the room. His laughter came easily and often. His handshake was firm and genuine, and his memory for names, for details, for the small intimacies that made strangers feel like friends, was nearly supernatural. Men who met Malcolm left believing they had made a true companion. They left planning their return. They left carrying a warmth that would sustain them through lonely nights on the road, a warmth that would eventually, inevitably, draw them back to Blackwood Manor. And then there was Judah, the youngest, at 19. Judah was the quiet one, the one guests would sometimes forget was in the room until they turned and found him there, watching, listening, saying nothing. He had a way of blending into the background that was almost eerie, a stillness that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. But his hands told a different story. Judah could work wood and metal in ways that bordered on artistry. He had built the manor's furniture, forged its hinges and latches, crafted the intricate locks that secured its doors. His workshop, set back from the main house behind a screen of hemlocks, was filled with half-finished projects that guests admired without understanding. They did not know that Judah's talents extended beyond cabinetry and blacksmithing. They did not know that he had built, over the years, a series of structures in the deeper woods, structures designed with a precision that had nothing to do with furniture. The manor itself had been constructed by their grandfather in 1803, when the stagecoach road was little more than a blazed trail through territory that remained contested and dangerous. By 1858, when Elias died and left it to his sons, it had become one of the most respected stops between the eastern cities and the frontier. The main house was a grand two-story structure of fieldstone and timber, its windows lit at night like a ship on a dark sea, its great room dominated by a fireplace large enough to roast an entire deer. There were 8 guest rooms, each furnished with Judah's careful craftsmanship, each with linens that smelled of lavender and fresh air. The kitchen was vast, capable of feeding dozens, and the pantry was always stocked with preserves, cured meats, and the brothers' own rye whiskey, aged in barrels that Silas had bought at considerable expense from a distiller in Kentucky. What made Blackwood Manor exceptional, though, was not its physical comforts. It was the atmosphere the brothers cultivated, an atmosphere of genuine welcome that felt, to the men who passed through, like something they had been missing their entire lives. Silas would sit with guests by the fire, discussing business and politics, making them feel intellectually respected. Malcolm would play his fiddle in the evenings, drawing out songs that made men think of home, of lost loves, of roads not taken. Judah would appear with a freshly carved pipe or a repaired saddle strap, small kindnesses that spoke to a deeper attentiveness, and the whiskey flowed freely, loosening tongues, softening edges, building a camaraderie that felt, in the moment, like the truest thing in the world. But there was something darker moving beneath this surface of mountain hospitality. The isolation that had once protected the Ellsworth family from the dangers of frontier. Life now provided something else entirely: privacy and privacy. In the hands of three men who had learned to read the vulnerabilities of others with the precision of surgeons, was a weapon more lethal than any firearm. It was a November evening in 1859 when the first man disappeared, though no one knew it at the time. His name was Arthur Pendleton, a land speculator from Philadelphia, traveling west with a heavy purse and a heavy heart. His wife had died the previous spring, and he had sold his practice, his house, everything that tied him to his old life, determined to make a new start in the Ohio River Valley. He was 43 years old, alone for the first time in his adult life, and carrying not just money but a desperate, unacknowledged hunger for human connection. The weather had turned vicious that week, a sudden cold snap that froze the roads and made travel treacherous. Pendleton's horse had thrown a shoe 10 miles back, and he had walked the final stretch, leading the animal by its bridle. His face chapped raw, his fingers numb despite his gloves. When he crested the final ridge and saw the lights of Blackwood Manor through the trees, he later told a fellow traveler he wept, not from the cold, not from the exhaustion, but from the simple, overwhelming relief of not being alone. Silas met him at the door with a look of concerned welcome that Pendleton would remember for the rest of his short life. "You look half frozen, friend," Silas said, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and warmth that made men instinctively trust him. "Come inside. We'll get you warm. We'll get you fed. You found your way home, Mr. Pendleton." He had not told them his name. He was certain he had not told them his name. But Silas had used it without hesitation, and in that moment, Pendleton felt less like a stranger and more like a man who had been expected. A man who was known. He stepped inside, and the warmth hit him like a blessing. The fire was roaring, the smell of roasting meat filled the air, and Malcolm was there, rising from his chair with a glass of whiskey already poured, his smile wide and genuine. "Arthur Pendleton," Malcolm said, as though tasting the name. "That's a fine name. That's a name that belongs in a story." Over the next 4 days, the Ellsworth brothers gave Arthur Pendleton an experience unlike anything he had encountered in all his years of travel. Malcolm sat with him for hours, drawing out his history, his grief, his hopes for the future, listening with such focused attention that Pendleton felt, for the first time since his wife's death, that someone truly saw him. Silas engaged him in discussions about land values and development, treating his opinions with respect, making him feel like a man of consequence again. Judah repaired his saddle, sharpened his knives, and carved him a small wooden bird-a-robin, Pendleton's wife's favorite that he presented with a shy smile and no words at all. On his third night, after the whiskey had flowed freely and the fire had burned low, Pendleton found himself sitting alone with Malcolm in the great room. The other guests had retired, and the silence between them was comfortable, companionable. Malcolm played a slow air on his fiddle, something Pendleton thought he recognized but could not name, a melody that seemed to reach into his chest and turn something that had been locked. "I lost someone too," Malcolm said quietly, setting the fiddle aside. "A woman, years ago. Fever took her, and I remember thinking that I would never feel anything again, that the world had gone grey and it would stay that way." Pendleton said nothing. He could not speak. "But I learned something," Malcolm continued, leaning forward, his eyes catching the firelight. "I learned that grief is just love with nowhere to go. And if you find someone to give it to, someone who needs it as badly as you do, it stops being a weight and starts being a bridge." He let the words hang in the air. Pendleton felt tears on his face, tears he had not shed in months, and when Malcolm reached across and placed a hand on his arm, he did not pull away. He sat there in the firelight, a man who had lost everything, and let himself believe that he had found something new, something that might, against all reason, save him. What happened that night was never recorded in any ledger or journal, but Pendleton's behavior the following morning told its own story. He moved through breakfast with a lightness that had been absent from his bearing for months. He laughed at Malcolm's jokes, praised Silas's business acumen, and told Judah that the carved robin was the finest gift anyone had ever given him. He extended his stay by 3 days, then by another week, making plans to return on his journey east. Speaking of Blackwood Manor not as an inn but as a place he now thought of as home, when he finally departed, on a clear, cold morning with frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds, he pressed a purse of gold coins into Silas's hands that far exceeded the cost of his stay. "I've never known hospitality like this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll tell everyone I meet about this place. I'll come back. I promise I'll come back." Silas smiled, pocketed the money, and watched Pendleton ride down the winding road toward the stagecoach route that would take him west. He watched until the figure disappeared into the trees, a dark shape swallowed by the bare branches, and then he stood there for a long moment, his breath misting in the cold air, his pale eyes fixed on the place where the road curved out of sight. Behind him, the door of the manor stood open, warm light spilling onto the porch, and for a moment, Silas looked less like a gracious host and more like a man calculating the exact weight of what he had just gained. 3 days later, a horse was found wandering near a creek crossing 12 miles from Blackwood Manor. It was Arthur Pendleton's horse, still saddled, still carrying his bedroll and his remaining supplies, its coat matted with sweat and its eyes wild with confusion. Pendleton himself was nowhere to be found. The assumption, logical enough for the dangerous frontier, was that he had been thrown, struck his head, and been carried off by the icy current. Local men searched the creek banks for 2 days before giving up, shaking their heads, muttering about the risks of traveling alone in winter, about how a man with a broken heart made careless choices. Only the Ellsworth brothers knew the truth. Judah had been waiting in the woods a mile from the manor, in a blind he had constructed years before, its walls lined with moss to muffle sound, its floor carpeted with leaves that would not crunch underfoot. He had watched Pendleton ride past, watched him pause to adjust his saddle, watched him glance back toward the manor with something like longing in his expression. And when Pendleton turned forward again, Judah stepped from the trees with the quiet grace of a creditor, who had made this motion 100 times before in his imagination. There was no sound, no warning. The blow came from behind, delivered with a blacksmith's hammer, struck with surgical precision to the base of the skull. Pendleton was dead before his body hit the frozen ground. His body was wrapped in canvas that Judah had prepared weeks earlier, loaded onto a handcart that followed a trail only the brothers knew. a trail that wound through hemlock groves and across rock-strewn ridges to a location deep in the mountain forest, where a limestone sinkhole provided a grave that would never be found. The gold was counted that night at the kitchen table. Silas, stacking the coins with the same calm efficiency he used for the inn's legitimate accounts. Malcolm watching with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Judah sitting in the corner, carving another bird. Saying nothing. "He won't be missed for months," Silas said, sliding the coins into a leather bag. No family, no close friends. A man who sold everything and told no one where he was going. A man who was already half a ghost before we ever met him. He was kind, Malcolm said quietly. There was something in his voice that might have been regret, or might have been something else entirely. He stared at the fire, its light playing across his handsome features, and for a moment the mask slipped. But only for a moment. "Kindness is what made him easy," Silas replied, his tone flat and final. "Kindness and loneliness and the need to be seen. That's what we offer, Malcolm. That's what we've always offered. The price is just a little higher than most people think." Judah finished his carving, a small bird with wings outstretched as though in flight, and set it on the table beside the bag of coins. He looked at his brothers, his face unreadable, and then he stood and walked out into the night without a word. The door closed behind him, and the fire crackled, and somewhere in the dark hills, the wind began to rise. In the months that followed, the Ellsworth brothers refined their operation with a patience and precision that would have impressed any professional. They learned to identify ideal targets with increasing accuracy. Men traveling alone, carrying significant funds, with few family connections and no fixed schedules. Men who had been weakened by grief, by failure, by the slow erosion of hope that came with years on the road. Men who would not be missed, or who would not be missed for long enough that any investigation would lose momentum before it began. And they learned something else, something more valuable than gold. They learned that the best way to make a man disappear was to make him want to disappear, to give him so much warmth, so much attention, so much sense of belonging, that when he rode away from Blackwood Manor, he was already carrying a piece of it with him, already planning his return, already blind to the fact that the road ahead would never take him anywhere at all. Between 1859 and 1874, Blackwood Manor achieved a reputation that extended far beyond the Allegheny highlands. Travelers spoke of it in the same reverent tones reserved for the finest establishments in Philadelphia or Baltimore, comparing its comforts to the great hotels of the eastern cities. The Ellsworth brothers had created something unprecedented, a remote mountain manor that provided luxury, accommodations, and service that rivaled anything a man could find in the civilized world. Silas had expanded their legitimate business operations with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to everything else. The manor now maintained a stable of 30 quality horses for guests, their coats gleaming, their stalls kept immaculate by a stable hand who had worked for the family since before Elias's death. The sawmill operated year-round now, its output sold to contractors building the new railroad lines that were slowly pushing westward. The gristmill served farmers from 3 counties, its stone wheels grinding wheat and corn into flour that was shipped as far east as Harrisburg. And the whiskey, aged in barrels that Silas had sourced from a Kentucky distiller who had since gone out of business, had become legendary in its own right, sought after by men who had never even stayed at the manor but had heard stories of its smooth, honeyed warmth. These legal enterprises provided substantial income. more than enough to maintain the property and support the three brothers in considerable comfort. But more importantly, they gave the Ellsworths a reputation as savvy businessmen, pillars of the mountain community whose word carried weight in every settlement for 100 miles. When Silas sat on the board of the Regional Merchants Association, his fellow members saw a prosperous landowner who had built something from nothing. When Malcolm played his fiddle at community gatherings, his neighbors saw a charming bachelor who had chosen to remain close to his brothers rather than seek a wife. When Judah repaired a farmer's plow or crafted a set of chairs for the local church, his silence was interpreted as shyness, a harmless quirk that added to the family's rustic appeal. The guest registry from this period, carefully preserved in the manor's office, tells the story of their success. Merchants from Baltimore, politicians from Harrisburg, land speculators from New York, and adventurers from as far away as Boston signed their names in Silas's elegant hand, each entry accompanied by a note of the guest's hometown and intended destination. Many returned multiple times, becoming regular patrons who praised Blackwood Manor to their colleagues and friends. Some even sent letters of recommendation ahead of their visits, ensuring that their associates would experience the same remarkable hospitality that had so transformed their own journeys. But hidden within this legitimate success was a carefully orchestrated machinery of death that operated with clockwork precision. The brothers had refined their victim selection to an exact science over the course of 15 years. Silas had developed a system for identifying ideal targets based on a dozen different variables, from the weight of a man's purse to the loneliness in his eyes, from the frequency of his letters to the number of people who would notice if he never arrived at his destination. He kept a private ledger, its pages filled with notations that would have meant nothing to anyone who did not know the code he had devised. Initials, dates, amounts, and a single word in the final column, resolved. Malcolm had perfected the art of emotional manipulation during those years, learning to read men's deepest needs with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. He studied each target carefully, adapting his personality to match their desires with the precision of an actor, playing a role he had performed 1,000 times. For the grieving, he offered comfort and understanding, listening to their stories with tears in his eyes, sharing his own carefully manufactured losses to create a bond that felt unbreakable. For the ambitious, he became an admiring protege, hanging on their words, seeking their advice, making them feel powerful and wise. For the lonely, he became a friend, a brother, a confidant, someone who asked nothing and gave everything. His ability to become whatever a man needed was both his greatest weapon and his most chilling talent, a gift that allowed him to reach into the darkest places of a man's heart and find exactly what would make him vulnerable. Judah's role in the operation had evolved significantly over the years. What had begun as simple physical labor, the disposal of bodies and the erasure of evidence, had grown into something far more sophisticated. His workshop behind the hemlock screen now contained not just woodworking, tools, but an array of equipment that would have alarmed anyone who saw it. There were vats of quicklime for accelerating decomposition, tanks of acid for destroying personal effects, and a collection of specialized tools designed for tasks that no carpenter would ever need. But Judah's most valuable contribution was his knowledge of the mountain. He had spent years mapping every ridge and ravine, every cave and sinkhole, every hidden hollow where a man could be buried and never found. He knew where the soil was soft and where it was rocky. He knew which slopes drained quickly and which held water for months. He knew where to place a body so that the mountain itself would do the work of erasing it. The logistics of disposal had been refined to a brutal efficiency. The limestone sinkhole that had received Arthur Pendleton's body was only one of a dozen. Such sites scattered across the Ellsworth property, each chosen for its remoteness and its geological properties. Bodies were wrapped in canvas that Judah had treated with chemicals to accelerate decomposition, then weighted with stones and lowered into crevices that had been formed tens of thousands of years earlier, when this entire region lay beneath an ancient sea. The chemistry of the limestone, combined with the constant cool temperature of the crevices, meant that within 6 months there was nothing left but bone. And within 2 years, even the bones had dissolved, returned to the minerals from which they had been formed. Between 1860 and 1874, the brothers claimed victims at a rate of 3 to 5 per year, never more, never less. Silas had calculated that this was the optimal number, enough to generate significant profit without creating patterns that might attract attention. They never took more than 1 victim per month, and they varied their methods enough to prevent any obvious signature from emerging. Some men were poisoned with extracts that Judah prepared from plants he cultivated in a hidden garden behind the workshop. Some were killed quickly with the hammer that had served them since the beginning. Some were dispatched by other means, methods that changed with each victim to ensure that no pattern could be discerned even by the most persistent investigator. The spring of 1861 brought the Civil War, and with it an entirely new class of potential victims. The conflict that tore the nation apart created chaos across the border states, and western Pennsylvania, with its strategic position between north and south, became a corridor for men moving in all directions. Deserters fleeing both armies, couriers carrying messages through contested territory, spies moving behind enemy lines, and ordinary citizens trying to reach family members or escape the violence that had engulfed their homes. The roads filled with men who had reasons to travel alone, reasons to keep their destinations secret, reasons to disappear without a trace. The brothers adapted to the changing circumstances with the same flexibility that had made their operation so successful. They cultivated relationships with officers on both sides of the conflict, providing accommodations for men in uniform and gathering information that could be used to identify potential targets. They learned to recognize the signs of a man who would not be missed, the deserter with no regiment to return to, the spy whose handlers would assume he had been captured, the civilian whose family had already been lost to the war. These were men who existed in the spaces between armies, men whose lives had been reduced to survival, men who carried money but no identity, no connections, no future. One such man was Corporal Thomas Ridgway, a Union soldier who had walked away from his regiment after the disaster at Fredericksburg. He was 23 years old, originally from a small town in Connecticut, and he had seen things in that frozen field that had broken something inside him that could never be repaired. He was carrying his pay, nearly 3 months' worth, and he had no intention of returning to the army or to the family who would be ashamed of his desertion. He was a man who had made himself invisible, and in doing so, he had made himself the perfect target. Ridgway arrived at Blackwood Manor on a raw March evening. His uniform coat torn and muddy, his boots held together with rope, his face gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. He had been walking for 3 days, avoiding roads, sleeping in barns and hollow logs, eating what he could scavenge. When he saw the lights of the manor through the trees, he almost turned back. Something in the back of his mind, some instinct that had kept him alive through Fredericksburg, whispered that he should keep moving, that there was danger in that warm glow. but the cold had reached his bones, and the smell of cooking meat drifted down the slope, and he was too tired, too hungry, too worn down to listen. Malcolm met him at the door with an expression of concern that was so perfectly calibrated it could have been painted. "Good Lord, man," he said, stepping aside to let Ridgway into the warmth. "You look like you've walked through hell. Come in and sit by the fire. Judah, get this man some whiskey. Silas, we need food, whatever's hot." Within minutes, Ridgway was sitting in a chair by the great fireplace, a glass of whiskey warming his hands, a bowl of stew steaming on the table beside him. Malcolm sat across from him, asking no questions, offering only comfort, while Silas quietly removed Ridgway's coat and boots and replaced them with dry clothes that fit well enough. Judah appeared with a basin of hot water and bandages, and without a word, began tending to the blisters on Ridgway's feet, his hands gentle, his face impassive. They asked nothing that night. They offered only warmth and food and silence. And that silence, that refusal to demand explanations or stories or gratitude, was more effective than any interrogation could have been. Ridgway, who had spent months expecting betrayal, who had learned to trust no one, who had survived by staying silent and invisible, found himself talking before he knew he was going to speak. He told them about Connecticut, about the farm he had left behind, about the girl who had promised to wait for him. He told them about Fredericksburg, about the charge across the open ground, about the men falling round him, about the moment he had turned and walked away. And when he finished, he sat in the firelight, waiting for judgment, for condemnation, for the door to be locked and the authorities summoned. Instead, Malcolm reached across and placed a hand on his arm. "You did what you had to do to survive," he said quietly. "There's no shame in that. There's no shame in wanting to live." Ridgway stayed at Blackwood Manor for 11 days. He ate Sarah's cooking, though in this version. It was Judah who prepared the meals, learning over the years to replicate the recipes their mother had taught them, adding his own touches, his own knowledge of herbs and their properties. He slept in a room that Malcolm had prepared for him, with fresh linens and a window that looked out over the valley. He helped Judah in the workshop, learning to carve, finding a peace in the repetitive motion of blade against wood that he had not known since childhood. And each night he sat with Malcolm by the fire, drinking whiskey and talking, letting the walls he had built around himself crumble, one stone at a time. On the 10th night, Malcolm played his fiddle for Ridgway, a slow, haunting melody that seemed to pull something out of the younger man's chest. Ridgway wept, openly, unashamed, and Malcolm held him as he wept, and in that moment, Ridgway believed that he had found something he had never expected to find again: a home, a family, a reason to keep living. The next morning, Ridgway told Malcolm that he had decided to stay. He would work at the manor, do whatever was needed, help with the livestock or the mill or the endless repairs that a property this size required. He would send word to his family that he was alive, that he was safe, that they should not worry. He would build a new life here, in these mountains, with these men who had shown him a kindness he had never known. Malcolm smiled, and his smile was warm, and his eyes held no hint of what was coming. "That sounds like a fine plan," he said. "We'll talk about it tonight. After you've rested." That afternoon, Judah brought Ridgway a cup of tea. It was a blend he had perfected over years of practice, a combination of foxglove and something else, something that produced symptoms that mimicked the aftermath of battle fatigue. the weakness and confusion that soldiers sometimes displayed months after the fighting had ended. Ridgway drank it without hesitation, trusting the man who had taught him to carve, who had bandaged his feet, who had shown him nothing but patience and care. He was dead within 4 hours, his heart giving out while he slept. Malcolm was the one who found him, and for a moment, standing in the doorway of Ridgway's room, looking at the peaceful face of a man who had finally stopped running, Malcolm's mask slipped completely. His face crumpled, something that might have been grief or might have been exhaustion passing across his features, and his hand trembled as he reached out to close Ridgway's eyes. But when he turned to face Silas, who had appeared silently behind him, the mask was back in place. "He went peacefully," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "He didn't suffer." "Good," Silas replied. "Judah will take care of the rest. We have a merchant arriving tomorrow from Pittsburgh. I'll need you fresh for that." Malcolm nodded and walked past his brother without another word. He went to his room and closed the door and sat on the edge of his bed, and for a long time he did not move. The fiddle was in its case in the corner, and he looked at it, and he thought about the melody he had played for Ridgway the night before, and he wondered if he would ever play it again. He knew that he would. He knew that he would play it for the merchant from Pittsburgh, and for the land speculator who was due the following week, and for all the other men who would walk through the doors of Blackwood Manor, looking for something they would never find. He would play it, and he would smile, and he would be the man they needed him to be. Because that was what Silas expected, and because somewhere along the way, Malcolm had stopped knowing who he was when he was not being someone else. The merchant from Pittsburgh arrived the next day, a hardware dealer named Henry Whitmore, who was traveling to negotiate contracts with the new foundries opening in the Ohio Valley. He was 52 years old, stout and prosperous, with a gold watch chain across his vest and a purse heavy with banknotes. He was also, Malcolm discovered over the course of their first evening together, deeply unhappy. His wife had died 2 years earlier, his children were grown and scattered, and his business, while successful, had become a prison rather than a purpose. He traveled because staying in Pittsburgh meant staying in the house where her things still sat exactly as she had left them. Malcolm played his fiddle for Whitmore that evening, and Whitmore wept, and Malcolm held him, and the machinery of Blackwood Manor turned on, patient and precise and utterly without mercy. The merchant from Pittsburgh, Henry Whitmore, extended his stay at Blackwood Manor from 3 days to 2 weeks. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life building something, a business, a reputation, a fortune, and he had done it alone, telling himself that the loneliness was the price of success. But here, in this mountain manor, with these brothers who seemed to understand him without requiring explanation, he discovered that the price had been higher than he had ever admitted. Malcolm played his fiddle for him each evening, drawing out songs that Whitmore remembered from his childhood, melodies his mother had hummed while she worked, tunes he had not heard in 40 years. Silas engaged him in conversations about business that went beyond surface transactions, probing into the structure of Whitmore's operations, the value of his contracts, the locations of his properties. And Judah, silent Judah, appeared each morning with a fresh cup of tea, brewed from herbs that seemed to ease the aches Whitmore had carried for years, aches that he had attributed to age but that softened under the young man's quiet ministrations on his 12th night at the manor. Whitmore sat with Silas in the great room after the other guests had retired. The fire had burned low, and the whiskey bottle was nearly empty, and Whitmore was talking about things he had never told anyone. He spoke of his wife, Eleanor, of her laugh, of the way she would stand at the window in the evenings, waiting for him to come home from the warehouse. He spoke of the night she died, of how he had been in another city when it happened, of how he had not made it back in time to say goodbye. He spoke of the years since, of the house that had become a museum, of the meals he ate alone in restaurants because he could not bear to sit at his own table. "I should have been there," he said, his voice cracking. "I should have been there." Silas listened, his pale eyes fixed on Whitmore's face, his expression one of deep and genuine sympathy. He reached out and refilled Whitmore's glass, his movements slow and deliberate. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly. "You built something that will last, something that will be remembered. That's not nothing, Henry." Whitmore looked at him, and in that moment, Silas saw something he recognized. It was the same look he had seen in Arthur Pendleton's eyes, in Thomas Ridgway's eyes, in the eyes of every man who had ever sat in that chair across from him. It was the look of a man who had given up. Not on life, not exactly, but on the idea that anything in his life mattered. A man who had been carrying something so heavy for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be light. A man who was ready to stop carrying it, no matter what that meant. The next morning, Whitmore told Silas that he had decided to change his plans. Instead of continuing west to negotiate his contracts, he would return to Pittsburgh and begin the process of selling his business. He would settle his affairs, distribute his wealth to his children, and then he would come back to Blackwood Manor. Perhaps he would buy a property nearby, he said. Perhaps he would spend his remaining years in these mountains, where he had found something he had not known he was looking for. Silas smiled, and his smile was warm, and he told Whitmore that he would be welcome any time, that there would always be a room waiting for him, that he would always have a place at their table. Whitmore left the following morning, riding east toward the stagecoach road that would take him back to Pittsburgh. He carried with him a small wooden bird that Judah had carved for him, a gift that he said he would treasure for the rest of his life. He also carried, though he did not know it, a dose of poison that had been carefully introduced into his system over the preceding 2 weeks, a slow-acting compound that Judah had perfected over years of experimentation. It was designed to mimic the symptoms of heart failure, the kind of sudden, massive failure that could strike a man of Whitmore's age without warning. It would not kill him on the road. It was not meant to. It was meant to wait, to build, to strike when he was far from Blackwood Manor, when there was no connection to be drawn between the hospitality he had received and the death that would follow. Whitmore made it as far as a settlement called Millersburg, 60 miles east of the manor, before he collapsed in the dining room of a small inn. The local doctor, summoned too late to save him, noted in his records that the deceased had suffered a massive coronary event, consistent with his age and his history of overwork. Whitmore's body was shipped back to Pittsburgh, where his children buried him beside his wife, and his business was eventually sold to a competitor, and his name faded from memory within a generation. Only the Ellsworth brothers knew that Henry Whitmore had been murdered. Only they knew that the slow-acting poison had been carefully calibrated to ensure that he would die far from their property, leaving no trail of suspicion. And only they knew that the purse of banknotes he had been carrying, along with the gold watch and the diamond cufflinks and the other valuables that had been in his saddlebags, were already hidden in the limestone crevice where Judah had placed them 3 days after Whitmore's departure, after the body had been found and the initial investigations had concluded. The years between 1865 and 1874 were the golden age of Blackwood Manor. The war ended, and the nation turned its attention westward, and the stagecoach road that passed the manor's property became one of the busiest routes between the eastern cities and the new territories opening up beyond the Mississippi. Merchants, land agents, mining speculators, railroad surveyors, and adventurers of every description poured through the Allegheny highlands, and nearly all of them had heard of the Ellsworth brothers and their remarkable establishment. Silas expanded their operations again, adding a second wing to the manor that increased their guest capacity to 15 rooms. He invested in a herd of thoroughbred horses that became legendary among travelers, animals that could carry a man from the manor to Pittsburgh in 2 days if he was willing to push them. He purchased the rights to a mineral spring on the property and began bottling the water, selling it to pharmacies in the East as a curative for everything from gout to melancholia. Each of these enterprises generated legitimate income, and each of them served to deepen the brothers' reputation as pillars of the community. But the true source of their wealth remained hidden beneath the surface of their legitimate success. Between 1865 and 1874, the brothers claimed approximately 30 victims, men who had made the fatal mistake of accepting their hospitality. Each death was carefully planned and executed according to protocols that had been refined over nearly 2 decades. The victims were always traveling alone, always carrying significant funds, always with few family connections and no fixed schedule that would raise immediate alarm. They were selected with a precision that bordered on artistry, their vulnerabilities identified and exploited with a ruthlessness that never varied. Consider the case of Nathaniel Croft, a mining engineer from Cornwall who arrived in the spring of 1868. Croft had been hired by a consortium of Philadelphia investors to survey mineral deposits in the Allegheny Mountains, a job that required him to travel alone through remote areas for months at a time. He carried surveying equipment worth considerable money, along with payment for his work and funds for purchasing mining rights that he had identified as potentially valuable. He was 47 years old, a widower with no children, and he had been living in the United States for only 3 years, long enough to establish a reputation as a skilled engineer, but not long enough to form the kind of close friendships that would lead anyone to search for him if he disappeared. Silas recognized Croft as an ideal target the moment he walked through the door. The man's British accent marked him as an outsider, someone who would not be missed by the local community. His profession meant that he spent weeks at a time in the wilderness, so an extended absence would not raise suspicion, and his obvious loneliness, the way his eyes lingered on the fire, the way he sat with his back to the wall, the way he flinched when someone approached him from behind, all of it spoke to a man who had been alone for too long, who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. The brothers deployed their strategy with the precision of a well-rehearsed performance. Malcolm engaged Croft in conversations about Cornwall, about the mines he had worked in as a young man, about the wife he had lost to consumption 5 years earlier. He listened with the same focused attention he gave all his targets, asking questions that showed he was paying attention, remembering details that Croft himself had forgotten. Silas discussed the mineral rights in the area, showing Croft maps and surveys that the brothers had accumulated over the years, positioning himself as a local expert who could help the engineer identify the most promising claims. And Judah, Silent Judah, provided the same quiet service he had provided for every victim before, repairing Croft's equipment, preparing his meals, brewing his tea. But Croft was more cautious than many of their previous targets. He was a man who had learned, through years of working in dangerous mines, to trust his instincts, and something about the manor made him uneasy. He noticed things that other guests had overlooked. The way Silas's eyes followed him when he thought he was not looking. The way Malcolm's questions sometimes circled back to the same subjects, probing, testing. The way Judah's silence seemed less like shyness and more like calculation. On his third night at the manor, Croft sat alone in his room, staring at the ceiling, trying to identify the source of his unease. He thought about the men he had met during his travels, the way they had spoken of Blackwood Manor with such reverence. He thought about the number of guests who had been at the manor when he arrived, 2 others, both of whom had departed before him, both of whom he had not seen since. He thought about the look in Silas's eyes when he had mentioned the money he was carrying, a look that had been there and gone in an instant, so quick that Croft had almost convinced himself he had imagined it. The next morning, Croft told the brothers that he had decided to move on. He had received word, he said, that his investors wanted him to prioritize a different region, and he needed to travel east to consult with them before continuing his work. It was a lie, and he was not sure any of the brothers believed it. But they accepted it with the same warm smiles they had shown him since his arrival. Malcolm shook his hand and told him to come back any time. Silas pressed a bottle of their best whiskey into his saddlebags. Judah handed him a small wooden carving, a compass rose, and said nothing. Croft rode away from Blackwood Manor with his heart pounding, and his hand never far from the pistol in his coat. He rode through the day and into the night, pushing his horse harder than he should have, not stopping until he reached a settlement 30 miles east of the manor. He told the innkeeper there that he had heard strange stories about the road, about men who had disappeared, and the innkeeper, an old man who had lived in the mountains his entire life, looked at him with eyes that held something Croft had not expected to see: recognition. "You're not the first to ask about that road," the innkeeper said, leaning close so that his voice would not carry, "and you won't be the last. The Ellsworth boys, they've got a reputation, but not the kind that gets talked about in polite company. Men go up that road, and sometimes they don't come back. And the ones who do come back, they don't talk about what they saw. They just keep riding." Croft stayed in that settlement for 3 days, and on the 4th day, he rode to the county seat and requested a meeting with the sheriff. His story was dismissed as the product of an overactive imagination, the kind of paranoia that sometimes afflicted men who spent too much time alone in the wilderness. The sheriff, a man named Wallace, who had been in office for 12 years, listened politely and then explained that there was nothing he could do based on a feeling. A man had to have evidence, he said. A man had to have something more than a story, about a look in someone's eyes. Croft left the sheriff's office with the sense that he had been dismissed, that his concerns had been noted and filed away in a drawer that would never be opened. He continued his work in the Alleghenies, surveying mineral deposits and filing reports to his investors. But he never returned to Blackwood Manor, and when he finished his contract and returned to Philadelphia, he told himself that he had imagined the danger, that the unease he had felt was the product of exhaustion and loneliness and the strange isolation of the mountains. But he never forgot the look in Silas Ellsworth's eyes. And when, years later, he read in a Philadelphia newspaper about the investigation that had finally exposed the truth about Blackwood Manor, he was not surprised. He sat in his apartment, the newspaper trembling in his hands, and he remembered the way Silas had looked at him when he mentioned the money. He remembered the way Malcolm's questions had circled back, again and again, to the details of his life, his family, his plans. He remembered the tea that Judah had brought him each morning, tea that he had drunk without thinking, tea that he now realized might have been the reason he had woken with a headache each day, the reason his hands had trembled, the reason his heart had sometimes raced for no apparent reason at all. He had survived. He realized, because he had left 3 days sooner than the brothers had expected. He had survived because the unease he had felt had been strong enough to overcome the warmth, the whiskey, the carefully manufactured intimacy that had claimed so many others. He had survived because something in him, some instinct honed by years of listening to the earth groan and shift beneath his feet, had told him to run. The innkeeper who had warned Croft was a man named Silas Barlow, and he was one of the few people in the region who had begun to suspect that something was wrong at Blackwood Manor. Barlow had run the inn at Millersburg for 30 years, and in that time he had seen the patterns of travel through the mountains change in ways that could not be explained by the normal ebb and flow of commerce. Men would pass through his establishment on their way west, full of plans and optimism, and they would mention that they intended to stop at Blackwood Manor, and then, weeks later, they would not pass through on their return journey. At first, Barlow had attributed these disappearances to the hazards of frontier travel. Men fell from horses, drowned in rivers, were set upon by bandits. It was a hard country, and the mountains claimed their share of souls every year. But as the years passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. The disappearances were too frequent, too concentrated, too consistently centered on that particular stretch of road. Barlow began keeping notes, recording the names of men who had passed through his inn on their way west and never returned. By 1870, his list contained more than 30 names. He had taken his concerns to Sheriff Wallace 3 times over the years, and 3 times he had been told that there was no evidence, that the mountains were dangerous, that a man who traveled alone took his life in his hands. Wallace, Barlow came to suspect, was either willfully blind or something worse. There were rumors that the Ellsworth brothers had contributed generously to Wallace's election campaigns, that they had provided horses and supplies to the sheriff's office during lean years, that there were ties between the families that went back generations. But Barlow was patient. He had lived in the mountains his entire life, and he had learned that the mountains gave up their secrets slowly, if they gave them up at all. He continued his notes, adding names, dates, details. He talked to travelers who had stayed at Blackwood Manor and emerged uneasy, like Nathaniel Croft, gathering their impressions, looking for patterns in their discomfort. And slowly, over the years, he built a picture of what was happening on that ridge above the stagecoach road. The beginning of the end came not from Barlow's investigations, however, but from an unexpected source, one of their own. Klaus Zimmer, in the original story, had a counterpart in this one, a man named Albert Crane, who had worked for the Ellsworth brothers for nearly a decade. Crane had been hired in 1865 as a stable hand, a position that had allowed him to observe the brothers' operations without being part of their inner circle. But over time, his duties had expanded. He had been present when bodies were moved, when evidence was destroyed, when stories were constructed to explain the disappearances, and the weight of what he had seen and done had been slowly crushing him. In the winter of 1874, Crane began to break. Albert Crane had been a quiet man when he first came to Blackwood Manor, a drifter from the coal country of western Pennsylvania who had lost his job when the mine where he worked collapsed, killing 43 men and leaving the survivors scattered to the winds. He had arrived at the manor in the autumn of 1865, looking for work, any work, and Silas had seen something in him that he recognized. A man with no family, no connections, no one who would ask questions if he disappeared. But Silas had also seen something else. A man who could follow orders without asking them. A man who could keep his mouth shut. A man who could be useful. For the first few years, Crane's role was limited to the legitimate operations of the manor. He tended the horses, maintained the carriages, handled the luggage of arriving guests. He was good at his work, efficient and unobtrusive. The kind of employee who did what he was told and never drew attention to himself. The brothers paid him well, better than he could have earned anywhere else, and they provided him with a small cabin at the edge of the property, a place of his own where he could live without interference. He was grateful, and he showed his gratitude by working harder than any other man on the payroll, by never complaining, by never asking questions about the things he saw that did not quite make sense, but the things that did not make sense accumulated over the years. There were the late-night movements, the sound of Judah's handcart creaking down the trail behind the workshop, the way Silas would sometimes disappear for hours and return with a stillness in his eyes that Crane had learned to recognize from his time in the mines. It was the stillness of a man who had seen something he could not unsee. The stillness of a man who had done something he could not undo. There were the guests who arrived and never seemed to leave. Not that they were seen leaving, at least. Their names would appear in the registry, and they would be present at meals. And then, one morning, they would not be there. Their rooms would be cleaned, their linens changed, their belongings vanished as though they had never existed. Silas would explain that the gentleman had departed early, before dawn, eager to continue his journey, and Crane would nod and say nothing, because that was his job, and because the money was good, and because he had learned long ago that asking questions was a luxury for men who could afford to lose what they had. By 1870, Crane had begun to keep his own private record, a notebook hidden beneath the floorboards of his cabin, where he wrote down the names of guests who had arrived and never been seen to depart. He did not know why he kept the record. Perhaps it was a kind of insurance, something to trade for his life if the brothers ever decided he knew too much. Perhaps it was a way of preserving something, a testament to the men who had walked into Blackwood Manor and walked out into nothing. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that kept him awake at night, perhaps it was because some part of him needed to know that what he was doing was wrong, that the silence he maintained was a choice, that he was not simply a machine following orders, but a man who had decided, again and again, to look away. The notebook grew thicker over the years. By 1874, it contained more than 40 names, each accompanied by a date, a description, and a note about the circumstances of the guest's arrival. Crane had learned to read the brothers' intentions the way a farmer reads the weather. He could tell, by the way Silas looked at a man, whether he would be alive by the end of the week. He could tell, by the way Malcolm's smile widened or narrowed, whether the warmth being offered was genuine or calculated, and he could tell, by the way Judah's hands moved, whether the tea he was brewing was meant to heal or to kill. The winter of 1874 was the worst Crane had experienced since he arrived at the manor. The snow came early and stayed late, burying the roads and isolating the property for weeks at a time. The brothers were confined to the manor with a handful of guests who had been trapped by the weather, men who had planned to stay for a night or two and found themselves unable to leave. Among them was a man named Oliver Finch, a schoolteacher from Connecticut, who was traveling west to take a position at a new college in Ohio. Finch was 34 years old, unmarried, with a small inheritance from his parents and a collection of books that he valued more than any material possession. He was also, Crane noticed, the kind of man the brothers had been selecting for years. Alone, vulnerable, carrying enough money to make his death profitable, but not so much that its absence would be noticed immediately. Crane watched the brothers work on Finch with the same sick fascination he had felt 100 times before. Malcolm played his fiddle for the teacher, drawing out songs that Finch remembered from his childhood, melodies his mother had played on the piano before she died. Silas engaged him in discussions about literature and philosophy, topics that Finch had never been able to discuss with anyone, making him feel intellectually valued for the first time in his adult life. Judah brought him tea in the evenings, tea that Crane had begun to suspect was laced with something that made Finch's eyes grow heavy, his speech slow, his defenses lower with each passing day. But something was different this time. Crane could see it in the way Malcolm looked at Finch, a look that went beyond the calculated warmth he showed all their targets. There was something in Malcolm's eyes that Crane had never seen before, something that looked impossibly like affection. Malcolm spent hours with Finch, not just in the calculated performances that had become second nature, but in genuine conversation. He asked Finch about his students, about the books he loved, about the future he had imagined for himself before grief and loneliness had closed in around him. And Finch, starved for connection, responded with an openness that Crane found painful to watch. On the 10th night of Finch's stay, Crane was in the stable, tending to the horses, when Malcolm appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, his hands shaking, and for a moment, Crane thought he looked like a man who had been running for a very long time and had finally run out of ground. "I can't do it," Malcolm said, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't do it again, Albert." Crane said nothing. He had learned, over the years, that silence was safer than speech. "He's a good man," Malcolm continued, stepping into the stable and closing the door behind him. "He's a good man, and he's alone, and he's afraid, and I can't be the one who—" He stopped, his hands gripping the edge of a stall, his knuckles white. The horses shifted in their stalls, sensing something in the air that made them uneasy. "He has money," Crane said quietly. "Silas will want it." Malcolm laughed, a sound that had nothing of joy in it. "Silas wants everything. Silas wants the money and the land and the power, and he wants me to be the one who gives it to him. He wants me to smile and play my fiddle and make men trust me so that he can take everything they have and leave nothing behind. And I've done it. I've done it for 15 years. I've done it so many times that I stopped counting. But I can't do it again. I can't do it to him." Crane looked at Malcolm, and for the first time he saw not the charming innkeeper, the gifted musician, the man who could make anyone feel like the most important person in the world. He saw a man who was drowning, a man who had been drowning for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe. "What are you going to do?" Crane asked. Malcolm looked at him, and there was something in his eyes that Crane had never seen before, something that looked like hope. "I'm going to tell him," Malcolm said. "I'm going to tell him to leave, tonight, before Silas decides that it's time. I'm going to tell him to take his books and his money and whatever else he has and ride east as fast as he can. And I'm going to tell him never to come back. And Silas," Malcolm's face hardened, "Silas doesn't need to know. Not until it's too late to stop it." Crane thought about the notebook hidden beneath the floorboards of his cabin. He thought about the 43 names written in his careful hand, names of men who had walked into Blackwood Manor and never walked out. He thought about Arthur Pendleton and Thomas Ridgway and Henry Whitmore and all the others. Men whose only crime had been to be alone, to be vulnerable, to trust the wrong people at the wrong time. "I'll saddle the horse," Crane said. That night. After the manor had gone dark, Crane led a saddled horse to the back door of the kitchen, where Malcolm was waiting with Oliver Finch. Finch looked confused, frightened, his eyes darting between Malcolm and Crane as though trying to understand what was happening. "You need to go," Malcolm said, his voice low and urgent. "You need to go now, and you need to ride east, and you need not to stop until you reach Millersburg. Do you understand?" Finch shook his head. "I don't understand. What is this? What's happening?" Malcolm gripped his shoulders, and for a moment, Crane saw something pass between them, something that looked like grief. "There are things I can't explain to you," Malcolm said. "Things I should have told you days ago. But you have to trust me now. You have to ride, and you have to keep riding, and you have to promise me that you will never come back here. Never. Do you understand?" Finch looked into Malcolm's eyes, and something in his expression shifted. Understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of it. "I understand," he said quietly. "Go," Malcolm said, "and don't look back." Finch mounted the horse and rode into the darkness, the sound of hooves fading into the wind. Malcolm stood in the doorway, watching, and Crane stood behind him, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. "He'll make it," Crane said finally. "He'll make it to Millersburg before dawn." Malcolm nodded slowly, but he did not turn away from the darkness. "I hope so," he said. "I hope that's enough." It was not enough. Silas discovered what had happened the following morning, when he went to the registry to note Finch's departure, and found that no departure had been recorded. He found Malcolm in the great room, sitting by the dead fire, his fiddle in his hands, his face empty. "You let him go," Silas said. It was not a question. Malcolm looked up at his brother, and for a moment, Crane saw something in his expression that he had never seen before. Defiance. Yes. Silas stood very still, his pale eyes fixed on Malcolm's face. He had $300 in his saddlebags. He had a collection of first editions that would have brought twice that at auction. He had information about land purchases in Ohio that could have made us thousands. And you let him go. "He was a good man," Malcolm said quietly. "He was a good man, and I couldn't." Silas crossed the room in 3 quick strides and struck Malcolm across the face with the back of his hand. The sound echoed in the empty room, and Crane, watching from the hallway, felt something in his chest tighten. "You don't get to decide that," Silas said, his voice low and cold. "You don't get to decide who lives and who dies. That's my decision. It's always been my decision, and you will not make it again. Do you understand me?" Malcolm touched his cheek, where a red mark was already forming. He looked up at his brother, and for a moment, Crane thought he saw something break behind his eyes. Something that had been holding together for 15 years, finally giving way. "I understand," Malcolm said. But Crane, watching from the shadows, understood something else. He understood that Malcolm had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He understood that Silas would never trust his brother again, and that a man who was not trusted in this operation was a liability. And he understood, with a certainty that settled into his bones like cold water, that Malcolm Ellsworth was now as much a target as any of the men whose names were written in the notebook, beneath his cabin floor. The days that followed were tense, the silence between the brothers thick enough to cut. Malcolm retreated into himself, spending hours alone in his room, the fiddle silent for the first time in Crane's memory. Silas watched him with the same calculating eyes he used to evaluate potential victims. And Crane, who had learned to read those eyes over years of observation, knew that his brother was being measured, assessed, weighed against the risk he now represented. Judah, as always, said nothing. He moved through the manor with his usual silence, tending to his workshop, preparing his herbs, going about his duties as though nothing had changed. But Crane noticed that Judah was watching too, his dark eyes following Malcolm with an intensity that had not been there before. And Crane wondered, not for the first time, what was going on behind that impassive face. Whether Judah felt loyalty to Silas, the brother who had built this empire, or to Malcolm, the brother who had finally shown signs of a conscience, or whether Judah, who had killed more men than anyone else in that house, had stopped feeling anything at all. The crisis came to a head 3 weeks later, when a letter arrived from Miller's. It was addressed to Malcolm and Crane, who retrieved the mail from the stagecoach driver, recognized the handwriting on the envelope. It was Oliver Finch's handwriting, the same precise, careful script that he had seen in the guest registry. He stood in the stable, holding the letter, and he knew that if he gave it to Malcolm, Silas would find out. He also knew that if he did not give it to Malcolm, he was making a choice that could not be unmade. He gave Malcolm the letter that evening, slipping it to him in the stable where they had talked 3 weeks before. Malcolm took it with shaking hands, and Crane watched as he read it by the light of a lantern, watched as his face shifted from hope to something that looked like peace. "He made it," Malcolm said softly. "He's in Ohio. He has the position at the college. He's safe." Crane nodded. "Then it was worth it," he said. Malcolm looked at him, and for a moment, there was something in his eyes that Crane had not seen in a very long time. Something that looked like gratitude. "Thank you, Albert," he said, "for everything," but Silas had seen the letter. Crane did not know how. Perhaps one of the other servants had noticed. Perhaps Silas had simply developed the same instinct for secrets that Crane had. But that night, after Malcolm had gone to his room, Silas appeared in the stable, his pale eyes fixed on Crane with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "What did the letter say?" Silas asked. Crane shook his head. "I don't know. I didn't read it." "You're lying," Silas said, and there was no anger in his voice, only a cold certainty. "You've been lying to me for weeks, Albert. You helped him. You saddled the horse. You've been hiding things. I know about the notebook." Crane felt his blood turn to ice. The notebook, the names, the dates, the evidence of everything that had happened at Blackwood Manor for the past 9 years. If Silas knew about the notebook, then everything was over. "I didn't," Crane started, but Silas held up a hand, and he stopped. "I'm not going to hurt you, Albert," Silas said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. "You've been loyal. You've been useful. But you've made a mistake, and mistakes have consequences. Malcolm made a mistake too, and I'm going to need you to help me fix it." Crane stared at him, understanding dawning slowly. "What do you want me to do?" Silas smiled, and it was the same warm smile he had shown 100 guests 1,000 times. But there was nothing warm behind it. "I want you to help me make sure that Malcolm never makes another mistake. I want you to help me make sure that no one ever finds that notebook. And I want you to remember, Albert, that you chose this. You chose us. And you're in too deep to choose anything else now." Crane thought about the notebook beneath his floorboards. He thought about Oliver Finch, riding east toward a future he did not know he had almost lost. He thought about the 43 names, the 43 men who had walked into Blackwood Manor and never walked out. And he thought about Malcolm, sitting alone in his room, clutching a letter from a man he had saved, believing perhaps that he had done something that mattered. "What do you want me to do?" he asked again, and his voice was steadier than he felt. Silas's smile widened. "Good man," he said. "Now, let me tell you about a tea that Judah has been perfecting. It's painless, they say peaceful, the kind of death that looks like sleep. And Malcolm, after everything he's done, deserves a peaceful death, don't you think?" Crane did not answer. He could not. He stood in the stable, surrounded by the warmth of the horses and the smell of hay, and he felt something inside him that he had thought was dead begin to stir. Not hope, exactly, but something that might become hope if he let it. Something that might become the courage to do what he should have done years ago. He waited until Silas had gone back to the manor, and then he walked to his cabin, and he lifted the floorboard, and he took out the notebook. He stood there for a long moment, holding it in his hands. 43 names and 43 stories, evidence of everything that had happened in this place. And then he tucked it inside his coat, and he walked to the stable, and he saddled a horse. He rode east that night, into the darkness, toward Millersburg, toward Sheriff Wallace's office, toward whatever came next. And behind him, the lights of Blackwood Manor glowed in the darkness, warm and welcoming, hiding their secrets for one more night. Crane rode through the night without stopping, the notebook pressed against his chest beneath his coat, the names of 43 men burning in his memory like embers that had never quite gone cold. The road east was treacherous in the darkness, the frozen ruts hidden beneath a fresh dusting of snow, but he pushed the horse hard, driven by something that felt like the first true purpose he had known in 9 years. He reached Millersburg just before dawn, the lights of the settlement flickering through the trees like the promise of something he had almost forgotten existed. A world where men did not disappear without a trace. A world where justice was more than a word whispered by the guilty. He went first to Silas Barlow's inn, knowing that the old innkeeper had been keeping his own records for years, knowing that Barlow would believe him when others might not. Barlow opened the door before Crane could knock, as though he had been waiting, as though he had known somehow that this night would come. His face, weathered by decades of mountain life, was grave but unsurprised. "You've got something to tell me," Barlow said. It was not a question. Crane pulled the notebook from his coat and held it out. 43 names, he said. 43 men who walked into Blackwood Manor and never walked out. And I helped. Every one of them. I helped. Barlow took the notebook with hands that trembled slightly, and he opened it, and he read. Crane washed his face as he turned the pages, saw the recognition in his eyes, the confirmation of suspicions that had been growing for years. When Barlow looked up, there were tears on his cheeks, but his voice was steady. "We need to go to Sheriff Wallace," he said, "now, before the sun comes up, before anyone can warn them." Crane shook his head. "Wallace is in their pocket. He's been covering for them for years. He'll burn this notebook before noon and have us both arrested for slander before nightfall." Barlow was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was hard. "Then we go around Wallace. There's a federal marshal in Pittsburgh, a man named Hartley who's been looking into disappearances along the Stagecoach Road for months. He came through here last week, asking questions, taking names. He'll listen. He has to listen." Dawn was breaking over the Alleghenies when Crane and Barlow rode out of Millersburg, heading east toward Pittsburgh. The road was a ribbon of frozen mud. the trees on either side bare and black against the pale sky. And Crane found himself thinking about the men whose names he had carried for so long. He thought about Arthur Pendleton, who had wept when he saw the lights of the manor through the trees. He thought about Thomas Ridgway, who had walked away from a war only to walk into something worse. He thought about Henry Whitmore, who had died alone in a strange town, thinking perhaps that his heart had finally given out. He thought about all of them, and he thought about the silence he had maintained for 9 years. And he rode faster. Federal Marshal Elias Hartley was a man in his late 40s, with the kind of face that had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. He had been investigating disappearances along the western stagecoach routes for 3 years, following a pattern that had begun to emerge from the chaos of the post-war expansion. Men who traveled alone, carrying money, with few connections and fewer reasons to be missed. Men who had stopped at certain establishments along the road and never been seen again. Blackwood Manor was one of a dozen properties on his list, but it was the one that had drawn his attention most strongly. Too many names, too many disappearances, too many men who had written letters describing the warmth of the Ellsworth brothers' hospitality and then never written again. Crane and Barlow found Hartley at the Federal Building in Pittsburgh, a grim stone structure that seemed to absorb the winter light. Crane laid the notebook on Hartley's desk and told him everything. The names, the dates, the methods, the tea that Judah brewed, the hammer that had killed Pendleton, the limestone crevices where the bodies had been disposed of. He told Hartley about Malcolm's breakdown, about Oliver Finch, about the letter that had sealed his decision to ride east. And when he was finished, he sat in the hard wooden chair and waited for what would come next. Hartley studied the notebook for a long time, turning the pages slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, his eyes were cold, but not with the coldness of judgment, with the coldness of a man who had seen the worst that human beings could do to each other, and had learned to set his own humanity aside in order to fight it. "You understand what you're asking for?" Hartley said. 43 men. "That's not a crime, Mr. Crane. That's a massacre. And you were there for every one of them." Crane nodded. "I know you'll testify. Yes, you'll be charged as an accessory. You'll go to prison, maybe for the rest of your life." Crane met Hartley's eyes, and for the first time in 9 years, he did not look away. "I know that too." Hartley closed the notebook and stood. "Then let's go bring them in." The raid on Blackwood Manor was conducted at dawn 3 days later, with a force of 12 federal marshals and 20 deputies from the surrounding counties. Hartley had chosen his team carefully, men who had no connections to the region, who owed nothing to the families whose influence had protected the Ellsworth brothers for so long. They moved up the winding road in silence, their horses' hooves muffled by the fresh snow that had fallen overnight, their breath misting in the cold air. Crane led them, his face set, his hands steady on the reins. He had spent 9 years walking the paths of this property, had known every trail, every ridge, every hollow where a man could be hidden. He led them past the sawmill, silent in the winter dawn, past the grist mill, its wheel frozen, past the cabin where he had lived for nearly a decade, the floorboard still raised where he had taken the notebook, and then the manor itself rose out of the mist, its windows dark, its doors closed, its porch lantern extinguished for the first time in Crane's memory. Hartley signaled, and the marshals spread out around the property, surrounding the main house and the outbuildings. Crane stood with Hartley at the front door, and for a moment he was back in that kitchen, watching Silas count gold coins, watching Malcolm's smile fade, watching Judah carve birds with hands that had killed so many men. He raised his hand to knock, but before his knuckles touched the wood, the door swung open. Silas Ellsworth stood in the doorway, his pale eyes moving from Crane to Hartley to the armed men behind them. He was dressed as though he had been awake for hours, his clothes neat, his hair combed, his expression one of mild curiosity rather than surprise. It was as though he had been expecting this moment for years, had known that it would come eventually, and had prepared himself to meet it with the same cold composure he had brought to everything else. "Marshal," Silas said, his voice carrying that same blend of authority and warmth that had disarmed so many men over the years. "This is an unexpected visit. Is something wrong?" Hartley stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Elias Ellsworth, you are under arrest for the murders of Arthur Pendleton, Thomas Ridgway, Henry Whitmore, and 40 other men whose names I have written in this warrant. You will come with me now." Silas's smile did not waver. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Marshal. My brothers and I run a respectable establishment. We have guests to consider. Perhaps you'd like to come inside and discuss this over breakfast." "I'm not here for breakfast," Hartley said. "I'm here to take you into custody. Your brother Judah is being arrested as we speak. Where is Malcolm?" For the first time, something flickered in Silas's eyes. Something that might have been concern, or might have been calculation. "Malcolm is unwell. He's been in his room for several days. Whatever you think you know, I assure you, he has nothing to do with it." "We'll see about that," Hartley said. He nodded to the marshals behind him, and they moved forward, past Silas. Into the manor, the search of Blackwood Manor revealed what 9 years of silence had concealed. In the workshop behind the hemlock screen, marshals found Judah's equipment. The vats of quicklime, the tanks of acid, the tools that had been used to erase the evidence of so many deaths. In the garden behind the workshop, they found the hidden plot where Judah had cultivated his poisons. Foxglove and water hemlock and nightshade, their roots carefully tended, their properties documented in notebooks that detailed the effects and dosages for each variety. In the kitchen, they found the canisters where the poisons were stored, labeled with codes that meant nothing to anyone who did not know the brothers' system. And in the caves behind the rockfall, the caves that Crane led them to with the certainty of a man who had walked that path 100 times in his nightmares, they found what remained of the 43. The limestone had done its work over the years, dissolving flesh and bone, returning the victims to the minerals from which they had been formed. But there were fragments that the mountain had not yet claimed: teeth, buttons, the corroded remains of pocket watches and belt buckles. A silver ring, its inscription worn smooth, that might once have belonged to a man who had a wife who waited for him somewhere. A leather wallet, its contents illegible, that might once have held the hopes of a future that never came. Judah was found in his workshop, seated at his bench, a half-finished carving in his hands. He did not resist when the marshals took him, did not speak, did not look at any of them. His face was as impassive as it had always been, his eyes fixed on something that none of them could see. And Crane, watching from the doorway, wondered what was going on behind that mask, whether Judah was thinking about the men he had killed, the birds he had carved, the brother he had served without question for nearly 20 years, or whether there was nothing behind the mask at all, only the silence that had always been there. Malcolm was found in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed, his fiddle in his hands. He looked up when the marshals entered, and Crane saw something in his face that he had never seen before. Not fear, not anger, not the calculated warmth he had worn like a second skin for so many years. Relief. The relief of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long, and had finally been allowed to set it down. "Albert," Malcolm said, and his voice was steady. "You came back." Crane stood in the doorway, and he did not know what to say. He had spent 9 years in this place. 9 years watching Malcolm smile and play his fiddle and make men trust him so that his brothers could kill them. And he had spent the last 3 days knowing that his testimony would put Malcolm on the gallows alongside Silas and Judah. He had done what he had to do. But standing there, looking at Malcolm's face, he felt something that might have been grief. "I had to," Crane said finally. Malcolm nodded slowly. "I know, I always knew you would, eventually. That's why you kept the notebook, isn't it? Because you knew, somewhere inside you, that this day would come, that someone had to remember." He stood, setting the fiddle carefully on the bed, and he walked toward the marshals with his hands extended, ready for the cuffs. As he passed Crane, he paused, and for a moment his mask slipped away entirely, and Crane saw the man underneath. Not the charming innkeeper, not the gifted musician, not the predator who had lured so many men to their deaths. Just a man who had done terrible things and had known for a very long time that there was no way back from them. "Tell Finch I'm sorry," Malcolm said quietly. "Tell him I'm sorry for everything." And then the marshals led him away, and Crane stood alone in the empty room, looking at the fiddle on the bed, and listening to the silence that had finally, after all these years, settled over Blackwood Manor. The trial of the Ellsworth brothers was held in the Allegheny County Courthouse in Pittsburgh, and it drew attention from newspapers across the country. The story of 3 brothers who had turned their mountain inn into a killing machine, who had murdered more than 40 men over nearly 2 decades, who had hidden their crimes behind a facade of hospitality and charm, was the kind of tale that captured the public imagination. Reporters filled the gallery, sketching the faces of the defendants, recording every word of testimony, competing to describe the horrors that had been uncovered in the caves behind the rockfall. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Samuel Cross, presented a case that was overwhelming in its scope and detail. Crane testified for 3 days, recounting the names and dates and circumstances of the murders he had witnessed, describing the methods the brothers had used, the disposal sites, the cover stories. Barlow testified about the disappearances he had documented over 30 years, the pattern of men who had passed through his inn on their way to Blackwood Manor and never returned. Experts in botany and chemistry testified about the poisons found in Judah's workshop, their properties, their effects, and one by one the families of the victims came forward. Men and women who had waited 4 years for word of their loved ones, who had clung to hope long after hope had become unreasonable, who finally had answers, however terrible. Malcolm testified for the defense, and his testimony was the most dramatic moment of the trial. He confessed to everything, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. He described the first murder, Arthur Pendleton, the man who had wept when he saw the lights of the manor. He described the methods they had refined over the years, the poisons, the hammer, the caves. He described his own role, the warmth he had offered, the trust he had cultivated, the men he had held as they wept and then led to their deaths. And when he was finished, he turned to the families in the gallery, and he said the words that Crane had carried with him from that morning in Malcolm's room. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry for everything. I know that's not enough. I know nothing will ever be enough. But I'm sorry, Silas did not testify. He sat through the trial with the same cold composure he had shown at the raid, his pale eyes fixed on the proceedings, his expression never changing. Judah did not testify either. He sat beside his brother, his hands folded on the table before him, his face as impassive as it had always been, and he said nothing at all. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts for all three defendants on multiple counts of murder in the first degree. The judge, a man named Harrison, who had presided over some of the most notorious cases in the state's history, called the Ellsworth brothers the most prolific killers he had ever sentenced. He condemned Silas and Malcolm and Judah to hang. Their executions scheduled for the first week of December. Crane was sentenced to 20 years in the Western Penitentiary for his role as an accessory, a sentence that he accepted without complaint. He had known, from the moment he rode east with the notebook, that there would be a price to pay, and somehow, sitting in the courtroom, watching the brothers being led away in chains, he felt that the price was worth paying. The executions were carried out on a grey December morning, with a crowd of hundreds gathered outside the Allegheny County Jail to witness the end of the Ellsworth brothers' story. Silas walked to the gallows with the same cold composure he had shown throughout the trial, his face set, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He offered no final words, no confession, no apology. He stood on the scaffold with his hands bound behind him, and he looked out at the crowd, and if he saw Crane among them, he gave no sign. Malcolm walked to the gallows with his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. A man who had already been condemned long before the jury spoke its verdict. He had asked, in the days before the execution, to see Crane one last time, and Crane had been brought to his cell, and they had sat together in silence for an hour. To men who had done terrible things, trying to find words that did not exist. When Malcolm stood to go, he had looked at Crane with something that might have been gratitude. "You did the right thing," Malcolm said. "You did what I should have done years ago." Crane had no answer for that. He had only the memory of a man who had wept when he saw the lights of the manor and a notebook full of names, and the silence that had finally, after all these years, been broken. Judah walked to the gallows with the same silence that had defined his entire life. He did not look at the crowd, did not look at his brothers, did not look at anything but the grey sky above him. He had asked for nothing in the days before the execution, had spoken to no one, had left no message, no confession, no explanation. He climbed the steps to the scaffold with the same quiet efficiency he had brought to everything, and he stood there, waiting, and when the trapdoor opened beneath him, he fell without a sound. Crane watched from the crowd, and he did not know what he felt. Relief, perhaps, that it was over. Grief, perhaps, for the men who had died, for the brothers who had killed them, for the years he had spent in silence, watching, doing nothing. He thought about the notebook, the 43 names, the 43 stories, and he thought about the men who would never come home, the families who would never have answers, the lives that had been taken for gold and whiskey, and the cold calculation of men who had learned to see other human beings as nothing, more than resources to be exploited. When it was over, when the bodies had been cut down and the crowd had dispersed, Crane stood alone in the cold December morning, and he thought about what came next. 20 years in prison. A life that had been stolen, perhaps, but a life that he had chosen to give back, one name at a time. He thought about Oliver Finch, somewhere in Ohio, teaching his students, living the life that Malcolm had given him. He thought about Silas Barlow, who had kept his own notebook for 30 years, waiting for someone to listen. He thought about the 43, and he thought about the notebook that he had carried through the darkness. The names that would now be remembered, the stories that would now be told. He turned away from the gallows, and he walked toward the prison that would be his home for the next 2 decades, and he did not look back. Behind him, the wind rose in the Alleghenies, carrying the first snow of winter down from the mountains, covering the road to Blackwood Manor, covering the caves, covering the graves of the 43, covering everything in a silence that was finally, after all those years, the silence of the dead. The Blackwood Manor case became one of the most studied criminal investigations in American history. The Ellsworth laws, as they became known, a legacy of the horror that had been.